In the harsh Kansas prairie of 1885, Ruth Albright stepped off a dusty wagon with nothing but heartache and hope. Her husband lay buried somewhere along the trail west, leaving her widowed, pregnant, and alone in a world that rarely showed mercy to women in her condition. The town of Dust Hollow offered little comfort, just a broken chapel that served as home to a dozen forgotten orphans and one overwhelmed minister trying to keep them all alive. But Ruth had something the children needed more than charity. A mother's heart and calloused hands willing to work. She turned scraps into feasts, sang lullabies over empty bellies, and somehow made that crumbling building feel like home. What she didn't expect was for Eli Thatcher, the town's wealthiest and most solitary rancher, to notice her quiet acts of love. Could one woman's generous spirit really melt the heart of a man who'd sworn off caring about anyone but himself?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The autumn wind carried dust and disappointment through the streets of Dust Hollow, Kansas, as it had for countless years before Ruth Albright arrived. The town squatted on the prairie like a collection of weathered bones, its buildings leaning against each other for support against the relentless wind. Main Street stretched barely 3 blocks, lined with establishments that served the basic needs of ranchers, farmers, and the occasional drifter. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and the small chapel that had seen better days. Ruth stood in the doorway of that chapel now, her worn carpetbag at her feet and her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. The late afternoon sun slanted through the cracked windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. Wooden pews, scarred and split from years of use, faced a simple altar where a cross hung slightly askew. But it wasn't the modest sanctuary that caught her attention. It was the sounds coming from behind the building. Children's voices, some laughing, others crying, all carrying the hollow note of constant hunger. Ruth followed the sound around the chapel to a ramshackle addition that had been built onto the back, its roof patched with mismatched boards and tar paper. Through the open door, she glimpsed a scene that would have broken a lesser woman's heart. 12 children, ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 14, sat around a table that had seen better decades. Their clothes were clean but patched, their faces scrubbed but gaunt. At the head of the table sat a man who looked as overwhelmed as the building itself, Reverend Samuel Morrison, his graying hair disheveled and his kind eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Mrs. Albright?" The Reverend rose as Ruth appeared in the doorway, his voice carrying a mix of relief and apprehension. "We weren't certain you'd come." Ruth stepped into the room, her presence immediately drawing the curious stares of the children. "The telegram said you had need of someone who could cook and help with the children." "I'm here." The Reverend's shoulders sagged slightly, as if her simple words had lifted a weight he'd been carrying too long. "Indeed we do. Please sit. Children, this is Mrs. Albright. She's come to help us." A chorus of shy hellos followed, along with studying looks that spoke of children who had learned early not to trust too quickly. Ruth settled herself carefully on the wooden bench, her movements deliberate and graceful despite her condition. "What are your names?" she asked, her voice gentle but clear. The oldest, a girl with serious brown eyes and prematurely adult mannerisms, spoke first. "I'm Mary. I'm 14. I help Reverend Morrison with the little ones." She gestured to the younger children clustered around her. "That's Tommy. He's 12. Sarah's 10, and she's good with mending. The twins are Jacob and James. They're 8 and always hungry." Ruth smiled at the twins, who grinned back with gap-toothed enthusiasm. "And the rest of you?" "I'm Luke," piped up a boy of about 6, his red hair sticking up in multiple directions. "I can milk the cow, mostly. Sometimes she kicks." "I'm Anna," whispered a girl of perhaps 5, her thumb hovering near her mouth. "I'm not supposed to suck my thumb, but sometimes I forget." "That's perfectly natural," Ruth assured her. "Growing up is hard work. Sometimes we all need a little comfort." The remaining children introduced themselves. Peter, age 9, who loved to whittle. Emma, 7, who collected pretty rocks. And little Benjamin, barely 4, who had been found on the chapel steps as a baby and had never known any other home. Reverend. Morrison cleared his throat. The children have been managing quite well, but I'm afraid my cooking skills are somewhat limited. We've been living mostly on beans and cornbread when we can afford the cornmeal. Ruth's practical eye swept the room, taking in the warm cook stove, the sparse pantry, and the general air of making do. What about supplies? How do you manage to feed everyone? The town contributes what it can, the Reverend said, his voice carrying a note of careful diplomacy. Some of the ranchers bring meat when they can spare it. Mrs. Henderson from the general store sometimes has vegetables that are past their prime, but still good for soup. We grow what we can in the garden, but the soil here is challenging. Ruth nodded, understanding the delicate balance of pride and necessity that kept the orphanage running. And my husband's cousin, Mr. Pettigrew? He was supposed to meet me at the station. A flush crept up the Reverend's neck. I'm afraid Mr. Pettigrew ... Well, he came by this morning. He said there had been a misunderstanding about your circumstances. He felt that his household wouldn't be suitable for a woman in your ... condition. The euphemism hung in the air like smoke. Ruth's hand moved protectively to her belly, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being judged for circumstances beyond her control. She had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and whispered comments since her husband's death, but the sting never quite dulled. I see, she said quietly. And you offered me shelter here? If you're willing, the Reverend said quickly. I know it's not what you were expecting, but we have a small room off the kitchen that we use for storage. It's not much, but it's clean and warm. And honestly, Mrs. Albright, we could use the help. I'm not ashamed to admit that I'm better with sermons than I am with supper. Ruth looked around the table at the children's faces, seeing hope and wariness in equal measure. These were children who had learned not to expect too much from adults, who had been disappointed before. Yet there was something in their eyes, a spark of possibility that her presence might mean something different. What's for supper tonight? She asked. The Reverend's face fell slightly. Well, we have beans, and there might be enough cornmeal for bread, if we're careful. Ruth stood, her decision made. Mary, would you show me to the kitchen? And perhaps a few of you could help me see what we're working with. The transformation was immediate. The children's faces brightened, and even the Reverend seemed to stand a little straighter. Mary led the way to the kitchen, which was hardly more than a corner of the main room, separated by a rough wooden counter. The cook stove was old, but functional, the kind that required patience and understanding to coax into cooperation. Ruth rolled up her sleeves and began taking inventory. The pantry was indeed sparse. Dried beans, a small sack of cornmeal, some salt, and a few withered onions. But Ruth had learned to make much from little during her months on the trail with her husband, and she had a few tricks that might surprise these children. Sarah, she called to the 10-year-old, would you help me sort through these beans? We'll need to pick out any stones or bad ones. As they worked, Ruth listened to the children chatter about their day, their chores, their small adventures, and disappointments. She learned that Tommy had been trying to repair a broken wheel on their cart, that Sarah was teaching little Anna her letters, and that the twins had discovered a family of rabbits living under the chapel steps. Do any of you know about herbs? Ruth asked as she examined the sad-looking onions, things that grow wild around here. Peter, the 9-year-old whittler, perked up. I know where the wild onions grow, and there's some kind of plant that tastes like pepper. Excellent. Tomorrow, perhaps you could show me. Tonight, though, we'll work with what we have. Ruth set the beans to soak, then began the careful process of stretching their meager supplies into a meal that would satisfy 12 children and 2 adults. She cut the onions thin, coaxing flavor from every slice. She found a small jar of bacon, grease that had been overlooked in the back of the pantry, and used it to add richness to the cornbread. As she worked, she hummed softly, an old song her mother had sung while cooking. The children grew quiet, drawn by the unfamiliar comfort of a woman's voice in their kitchen. Even the Reverend found himself relaxing, settling into a chair to watch this small miracle of domesticity unfold. The beans wouldn't be ready until morning, but Ruth managed to create a thick corn porridge flavored with the last of the bacon grease and wild onions. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and filling, and when she served it up in the mismatched bowls, the children ate with an enthusiasm that spoke of meals too often meager. "This is good," said Tommy, surprise evident in his voice. "Really good." "It's better than good," added Jacob, one of the twins. "It tastes like ... like home." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the simple words. These children had so little, yet they were generous with their praise. She thought of her own child, growing beneath her heart, and wondered what kind of home she would be able to provide. After supper, as the children helped clean up, Ruth found herself drawn to the leather-bound Bible that sat on the kitchen shelf. It had belonged to her husband, and she had carried it with her from their homestead. Between its pages were pressed flowers from their wedding day, and in the margins, notes in his careful handwriting about passages that had brought him comfort. She opened it now, finding a passage that had sustained her through the darkest days after his death. "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose." "That's a beautiful Bible," said Reverend Morrison, joining her at the counter. "I can see it's been well used." "It was my husband's," Ruth said softly. "He read from it every morning and evening. He said it was the only book a man really needed. But I think he read it more for the comfort than the commandments. A wise man, your husband." Ruth closed the book gently. "He was. He died trying to help a family whose wagon had overturned crossing a creek. The water was high, and he went in after their little boy. Saved the child, but the current took him." The Reverend was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of her loss. "I'm sorry for your grief, Mrs. Albright, but I'm grateful for the man he was and for the woman he helped shape. I can see his influence in your gentle strength." Ruth nodded, unable to trust her voice. Around them, the children were settling into their evening routines, their voices softer now, content with full bellies and the promise of better meals to come. As she prepared for her first night in the orphanage, Ruth reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a farmer's wife, with a small but comfortable home and a husband who loved her. Now she was a widow, pregnant, and alone, caring for a dozen children who weren't her own in a building that barely kept out the wind. Yet as she listened to the children's sleepy voices, as she felt her own child move within her, Ruth found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced since her husband's death: hope. These children needed her, and perhaps, in caring for them, she would find a way to heal her own broken heart. The prairie wind continued to blow outside, carrying its burden of dust and distance. But inside the orphanage, a different kind of storm was beginning to brew, one that would bring not destruction, but transformation to all who dwelt within its walls. Ruth had been at the orphanage for 3 days when Eli Thatcher arrived with the sick calf. She was in the garden behind the chapel, coaxing late vegetables from the stubborn soil, while keeping one eye on little Benjamin, who was supposed to be helping, but was mostly chasing grasshoppers. The morning sun felt good on her back, and for the first time since her husband's death, she found herself humming again. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up from the struggling bean plants. A man on horseback approached the orphanage, leading a horse that carried what appeared to be a bundle of blankets across its back. Even from a distance, Ruth could see the rider's broad shoulders and the way he sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. "Benjamin," she called softly to the little boy, "come stand by me, please." The child obediently trotted over, his small hand slipping into hers as they watched the stranger dismount. He was tall, Ruth noticed, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of quality but practical use. There was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested a man accustomed to solitude, and when he glanced toward the garden, she caught a glimpse of eyes the color of winter sky. "That's Mr. Thatcher," Benjamin whispered, as if sharing a secret. "He's got lots of cows and horses, and he never smiles." Ruth watched as the man untied the bundle from his horse, revealing it to be a young calf that hung limp in his arms. The animal was clearly ill, its breathing labored and its eyes dull. Without hesitation, the man Mr. Thatcher carried the calf toward the small barn that stood adjacent to the orphanage. Reverend Morrison. His voice carried across the yard, deep and slightly rough, like a man unaccustomed to raising it for conversation. Reverend Morrison emerged from the chapel, wiping his hands on a towel. "Mr. Thatcher, what brings you to us today?" "Sick calf," came the terse reply. "Thought the children might want to try nursing it back to health. No use to me if it dies anyway." Ruth felt a frown crease her brow. The words seemed harsh, but there was something in the way the man held the calf carefully. As if it mattered, that suggested his gruff exterior might be covering something else entirely. Several of the older children had appeared at the sound of voices, and they clustered around his mister. Thatcher settled the calf in a bed of clean straw. Mary immediately knelt beside the animal, her gentle hands checking for fever, while Tommy examined its legs for injury. "What's wrong with it?" Mary asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped birth and raise many animals. "Not eating properly," Mr. Thatcher replied, his attention focused on the calf rather than the children. "Mother rejected it. Sometimes happens with the weak ones." Ruth found herself stepping forward, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name. "May." "I?" The man's eyes lifted to hers for the first time, and she felt an unexpected jolt at the directness of his gaze. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 35, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. But it was the wariness in those pale blue eyes that caught her attention, the look of someone who had learned to expect disappointment. "Do you know about cattle?" His voice held a note of skepticism that might have offended another woman. "Some," Ruth replied simply, kneeling beside the calf with careful attention to her condition. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri before I married. We raised dairy cows." She ran her hands over the calf's ribs, feeling for the telltale signs of illness or injury. The animal was thin, but not dangerously so, and its breathing, while labored, didn't suggest pneumonia. "How long since it nursed?" 2 days, maybe 3. Ruth nodded, her attention focused on the animal. "It's weak from hunger more than sickness. The mother might accept it again if we can get some strength back into it first." She looked up to find Mr. Thatcher watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mary, could you ask Reverend Morrison if we have any milk? Even a little would help. And Sarah, see if there's a clean cloth we could use." The children scattered to do her bidding, their excitement at having a project evident in their quick movements. Ruth continued her examination of the calf, aware that Mr. Thatcher remained crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to his clothes. "You're new here," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. 3 days now. Ruth's hands continued their gentle exploration of the calf's condition. "Mrs. Albright, Ruth Albright. Eli Thatcher." The introduction came after a pause, as if he were deciding whether to offer it. "You're not from Kansas." "Missouri, originally. More recently, Colorado Territory, until my husband." She let the words trail off, unwilling to burden a stranger with her grief. "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple words, spoken without elaboration or false comfort, carried more weight than all the lengthy condolences she had received from her husband's family. Ruth glanced up to find those winter blue eyes watching her with something that might have been understanding. "Thank you." Mary returned with a small pitcher of milk and a clean rag, breaking the moment of connection. Ruth showed the children how to dip the cloth in milk and let the calf suck it, how to be patient when the animal seemed too weak to try, how to coax life back into something that had given up hope. "Will it live?" asked Benjamin, his small face serious with concern. "I think so," Ruth said, watching as the calf began to respond to their ministrations. Sometimes creatures just need to remember that they're worth saving. She felt rather than saw Mr. Thatcher's sharp look at her words, but she kept her attention on the children and the calf. After a few minutes, the animal began to suck more vigorously, and a small cheer went up from the gathered orphans. "There's a good sign," Ruth said, smiling at their enthusiasm. "Mary, you'll need to do this every few hours until it's strong enough to take a bottle properly. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am," Mary replied, her young face glowing with purpose. "We'll take turns, won't we, Tommy?" "Sure will," the boy agreed. "I'll take the night watches. I don't sleep much anyway." Ruth felt her heart squeeze at the casual way he mentioned his sleeplessness, recognizing in the 12-year-old boy the hypervigilance that came from too much responsibility too young. She made a mental note to see what she could do about that asterisk, Mr. Thatcher. She said, rising carefully to her feet, "Would you stay for dinner? It's not much, but you're welcome at our table." The invitation surprised them both. Ruth hadn't planned to offer it, but something about the man's careful distance from the children, combined with the gentleness she had observed beneath his gruff exterior, made her want to extend the gesture. Eli Thatcher looked as if she had offered him something dangerous. His eyes flicked from her face to the children clustering around the calf, then toward the door, as if calculating his escape route. "I don't. That is, I have work to do back at the ranch." "Of course," Ruth said, her voice carefully neutral. "Another time, perhaps." But as he prepared to leave, she found herself following him outside, drawn by an impulse she couldn't quite explain. "Mr. Thatcher?" He turned, one hand on his horse's reins, his expression wary again. "Thank you for bringing the calf. It means more to the children than you might realize, having something to care for." He studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to understand a puzzle. Most people would see a sick animal as a burden. Asterisk. Most people haven't learned yet that sometimes the things we save end up saving us in return. The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either of them had intended. Ruth saw something flicker in Eli's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he hadn't expected to hear from a stranger. He mounted his horse in one fluid motion, settling into the saddle with the ease of long practice. From that height, he looked down at her with an expression that was no longer quite so guarded. "Mrs. Albright," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was old-fashioned but not mocking. "Good luck with the calf." Ruth watched him ride away, noting the way he sat straight in the saddle despite the weariness she had glimpsed. In his eyes, something about the man intrigued her, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Perhaps it was the contradiction between his gruff words and gentle actions, or the way he had looked at the children with an expression of longing so brief she might have imagined it she remained in the yard long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, one hand resting on her growing belly, while the other absently toyed with something she had noticed, but not mentioned during their conversation. In the pocket of her apron lay a silver pocket watch that had fallen from Mr. Thatcher's vest when he knelt beside the calf. The watch was beautiful, clearly expensive, but when she had picked it up, she noticed something odd. The hands had stopped moving, frozen at exactly 10 minutes past 3. Ruth had intended to call out to him about the dropped watch, but something had held her back. There was an old superstition about stopped clocks and timepieces, that they marked the moment when someone's heart had been broken beyond easy repair. Looking at the beautiful, silent watch in her palm, Ruth wondered what had happened at 10 minutes past 3 to make Eli Thatcher's time stand still. Inside the barn, the children continued their vigil over the calf, their voices a soft murmur of encouragement and hope. Ruth listened to them as she stood in the fading light, thinking about second chances and the strange ways that broken things sometimes found their way to exactly where they needed to be. The watch grew warm in her palm, and Ruth made a decision. When next she saw Mr. Thatcher, she would return it to him. But perhaps, in the meantime, she might see if there was a way to get it running again. After all, she was becoming quite skilled at coaxing life back into things that seemed beyond. Hope. The calf lived. Within a week of Mr. Thatcher's visit, the small animal was standing on unsteady legs and bleeding for its makeshift bottles with an enthusiasm that delighted the children. Ruth watched from the kitchen window as Mary and Tommy took turns feeding it, their faces bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. "It's going to be a fine cow," said Benjamin, who had appointed himself the calf's primary companion. He sat in the straw beside the animal, his small hand stroking its flank with a gentle persistence that Ruth had come to recognize as his particular gift. "Indeed it will," Ruth agreed, settling heavily into the chair by the window. Her pregnancy was advancing noticeably now, and the simple tasks that had once been effortless required more careful planning. But the children had adapted to her condition with the resilience that marked their young lives. taking on additional chores without complaint and watching over her with a protective concern that touched her heart. She had established routines that worked around both her limitations and their needs. Mornings began before dawn with the lighting of the kitchen fire and the preparation of a substantial breakfast, usually oatmeal when they could afford it, or corn mush when they couldn't, but always flavored with whatever herbs and wild seasonings Ruth could gather or the children could find. After breakfast, the older children attended to their studies with Reverend Morrison, while Ruth worked with the younger ones on basic letters and numbers. She had discovered that little Anna had a quick mind for reading, and that the twins, Jacob and James, could calculate sums in their heads faster than most adults. Each child, she was learning, had particular strengths that bloomed under individual attention. The afternoons were devoted to practical skills. Ruth taught the girls to cook and preserve food, to mend clothing with neat, invisible stitches, and to make soap from kitchen grease and lye. The boys learned these same skills, but also spent time with Tommy, learning basic carpentry, and with Peter exploring the art of whittling that might someday provide them with a trade. "Mrs. Ruth," called Sarah from the doorway, "there's a man coming up the road. He's got something in his wagon." Ruth rose carefully and made her way outside, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. A familiar figure sat atop a loaded wagon, his broad shoulders unmistakable even at a distance. Eli Thatcher had returned, and this time he wasn't alone. His wagon carried what appeared to be lumber and supplies. The children gathered in the yard as the wagon drew closer, their curiosity evident in their whispered conversations. Ruth found herself checking her appearance automatically, smoothing her apron and tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear before catching herself in the gesture. What did it matter how she looked? This was purely a practical visit, surely. "Mr. Thatcher," she called as he brought the wagon to a stop near the barn. "This is an unexpected pleasure." He climbed down from the wagon seat with the same fluid grace she remembered, his eyes scanning the group of children before settling on her face. "Mrs. Albright, I see the calf is thriving. Thanks to your kindness in bringing it to us," Ruth replied. "The children have taken excellent care of it." "We named her Buttercup," announced Benjamin, who had appeared at Ruth's side with his usual sudden materialization. "Because she's going to give us butter someday." A ghost of a smile flickered across Eli's features, so brief that Ruth might have imagined it. "Buttercup, that's a fine name for a cow. What's in the wagon?" asked Tommy, his practical mind already assessing the potential of the loaded supplies. "Lumber," Eli replied, his voice taking on that careful neutrality Ruth was beginning to recognize as his defense against deeper engagement. "Notice the barn roof has some weak spots. Thought you might need some repair materials before winter sets in properly." Ruth felt her heart do something unexpected in her chest. "That's very generous of you, but we couldn't possibly. It's excess from a building project," Eli interrupted, the lie so smooth that Ruth almost believed it. "Almost. No use to me now. Better it gets used than rots in my barn." Reverend Morrison appeared from the chapel, drawn by the sound of voices. "Mr. Thatcher, how good to see you again. Though I'm afraid we're not in a position to purchase materials right now. "No purchase necessary," Eli said firmly. "Like I told Mrs. Albright, it's excess stock. But I could use some help unloading it if the boys are willing." Tommy and Peter needed no further invitation. They were already moving toward the wagon, their young faces eager with the prospect of real work. Ruth watched as Eli began directing them in the unloading, noting how he spoke to them as equals, giving clear instructions without condescension. "Mary," Ruth said quietly to the eldest girl, "would you help me prepare some coffee? And perhaps we can find something to go with it." In the kitchen, Ruth found herself moving with unusual care, aware that she was preparing refreshments for a guest rather than simply feeding the household. She had managed to acquire some real coffee beans from Mrs. Henderson at the general store, trading mending work for the luxury, and now seemed like the perfect time to use them. "Do you like Mr. Thatcher?" Mary asked as she helped arrange the simple wooden cups on a tray. Ruth paused in her grinding of the coffee beans. "I hardly know him well enough to form an opinion. He seems kind in his way." "He's not married," Mary continued with the matter-of-fact tone that marked her observations. "Mrs. Henderson says he's been alone on that ranch for years. Ever. Since his parents died." "Mary," Ruth said gently, "it's not polite to gossip about people." "I'm not gossiping," Mary replied with dignity. "I'm just saying he looks at you different than most folks look at people, like he's trying to figure something out." Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, the sound of hammering began outside. Through the window, she could see Eli on the barn roof, his movements sure and practiced as he began replacing the damaged boards. Tommy and Peter were on the ground, handing up materials and clearly thrilled to be part of the project. The work continued through the afternoon, with various children taking turns, helping while others attended to their regular chores. Ruth found herself frequently drawn to the window, ostensibly to check on the children's safety, but really to watch the steady, competent way Eli approached the repair work. When she carried the coffee tray outside, she found him taking a brief rest in the shade of the barn, his shirt damp with honest sweat and his hair pushed back from his forehead. The children clustered around him, asking questions about construction techniques and ranch work with the enthusiasm of young minds hungry for new knowledge. "Coffee, Mr. Thatcher?" Ruth offered, extending a cup. He accepted it with a nod of thanks, his fingers brushing hers briefly as he took the cup. The contact was purely accidental, but Ruth felt it like a small shock of recognition, as if her body had been waiting for that simple touch. "This is excellent coffee," he said after taking a sip. "Better than what I make for myself." "The secret is in the grinding," Ruth replied, settling herself carefully on a nearby stump. "My mother taught me that fresh ground beans make all the difference. Your mother was a wise woman. She was. She died when I was 16, but she made sure I knew how to manage a household before she passed." Ruth's voice carried the old sadness, but also warmth at the memory. "She used to say that a woman who could cook well would never want for a place in the world." Eli's eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. She was right about that. The children here are fortunate to have someone who cares for them so well. They're good children. They make it easy. Not all women would see it that way, Eli said quietly. "Taking on a dozen orphans, especially in your condition." The words hung between them, acknowledging what they had both been carefully not discussing: her pregnancy, her widowhood, the unusual circumstances that had brought her to this place. Ruth felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being the subject of speculation and judgment. "They needed someone," she said simply. "And I needed ... purpose, I suppose. It seems to be working out well for all of us." Eli nodded, slowly, as if her answer had confirmed something he had been wondering about. Purpose is important. Gives a person reason to get up in the morning. There was something in his voice that suggested he spoke from experience, perhaps of mornings, when purpose had been hard to find. Ruth found herself wanting to ask about those mornings, about what had brought him to his solitary life on the ranch, but she sensed that such questions would only make him withdraw. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and withdrew the silver pocket watch she had been carrying since his last visit. "You dropped this the other day," she said, extending it toward him, "when you were examining the calf." Eli's face went very still as he stared at the watch in her palm. For a moment, Ruth thought he might not take it, might deny that it belonged to him. Then slowly, he reached out and lifted the timepiece from her hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I hadn't realized I'd lost it." Ruth watched as he slipped the watch into his vest pocket without looking at it, noting the way his jaw tightened slightly as he did so. "It's beautiful," she said gently, "though I noticed it seems to have stopped." "Yes," Eli replied, his eyes focused somewhere beyond her shoulder. "It stopped working some time ago." The pain in those simple words was so evident that Ruth felt her heart constrict with sympathy. Whatever had happened at 10 minutes past 3, it had been significant enough to break more than just the mechanism of a watch. "Sometimes things can be repaired," she said softly, "even when they seem beyond hope." Eli's eyes snapped back to her face, and for a moment she saw in them a vulnerability so raw that it took her breath away. Then the shutters came down again, and he was back to being the careful, controlled man who kept the world at arm's length. "Some things," he said, rising to his feet and brushing dust from his pants. "But not all." Ruth watched him return to his work on the roof, noting the way. He threw himself into the physical labor as if it could chase away whatever memories the watch had stirred up. Around them, the children continued their various activities, unaware of the undercurrents of emotion that had passed between the adults' dot as the afternoon wore on. Ruth found herself thinking about her carved wooden toy horse that sat on the shelf in her small room. Her husband had made it during the early months of their marriage, carving it from a piece of oak with infinite patience and love. He had intended it for the children they hoped to have someday, children who would play with it and love it and pass it on to their own little ones. Now, watching Benjamin chase grasshoppers in the yard while his friends tended to their various chores, Ruth thought perhaps it was time for the little horse to find its purpose. Children needed toys, needed reminders that the world held beauty and whimsy alongside its hardships. Tonight she decided she would give the horse to Benjamin, and in doing so, perhaps give a piece of her husband's love to this new family she was building. The thought filled her with a bittersweet combination of grief and hope, much like the feeling she got when she looked at Eli Thatcher working on the roof, a sense that some gifts were meant to be passed on. That love lost could become love found if one had the courage to open one's heart to new possibilities. The wooden horse found its new home quickly. Benjamin clutched it to his chest the moment Ruth placed it in his small hands, his eyes wide with the wonder of receiving something made just for play rather than utility. "It's mine?" he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the gift disappear. "It's yours," Ruth confirmed, settling beside him on his narrow bed. Around them, the other children were preparing for sleep, but all activity had paused as they watched this small ceremony of giving. "My papa made it," Ruth continued, her voice gentle in the lamplight. "He carved it from oak wood, and he put all his love for children into every cut of his knife. Now I think he would want you to have it, to play with and care for." Benjamin's fingers traced the smooth lines of the horse's mane, exploring the careful craftsmanship with the reverence of a child who had owned few precious things. "What was your papa like?" "He was kind," Ruth said, the familiar ache of loss softened now by the joy of sharing her husband's memory. "He had gentle hands and a patient heart. He would have loved all of you children very much." Mary approached quietly from her own bed, her nightgown pristine white in the dim light. "Could you tell us about him sometime? About what it was like, being married to someone good?" The request surprised Ruth with its wistfulness. These children had seen so little of lasting love, of stable families, that marriage itself seemed like a fairy tale to them. She thought of Eli Thatcher, working on their roof with such careful attention, and wondered what stories of love and loss he might carry. "Someday," she promised, "when you're older and ready to understand about such things." The next morning brought the first real frost of the season, silver crystals coating the prairie grass and reminding everyone that winter was approaching faster than they might have liked. Ruth woke early, as had become her habit, to stoke the fire and begin the day's bread. Her movements were slower now, more deliberate. As her pregnancy progressed into its final months, she was surprised to find smoke already rising from the kitchen chimney when she emerged from her small room. In the kitchen, she discovered Tommy at the stove, carefully tending a pot of oatmeal and looking pleased with his early morning initiative. "Thought I'd help," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You've been looking tired lately." Ruth felt her heart squeeze with affection for this boy who carried too much responsibility on his young shoulders. "That's very thoughtful, Tommy, but you don't need to worry about taking care of me." "Maybe not," he replied, stirring the oatmeal with careful attention, "but I want to." "We all do. You've made this place feel like ... well, like home. We want to take care of our home." The simple declaration brought tears to Ruth's eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. These children had claimed her as surely as she had claimed them, and the knowledge filled her with both joy and fierce protectiveness. The morning routine proceeded smoothly, with the children falling into their established patterns of chores and studies. Ruth was teaching Anna her letters when the sound of an approaching wagon drew everyone's attention to the windows. "It's Mr. Thatcher again," announced Peter, who had the keenest eyes for distance spotting. "And he's got more stuff in his wagon." This time, Eli brought materials for repairing the chapel's front steps, which had been sagging dangerously for months. He also carried a bundle that turned out to contain sturdy winter coats for the children, each one carefully sized and practical, rather than fashionable. "From a family in town," he said when Reverend Morrison protested the generosity. "Their children outgrew them, and they thought yours might have use for them." Ruth watched the children try on their new coats, noting how perfectly each one fit, and wondered which family in Dust Hollow had children so conveniently sized to match their orphans. The lie was kind and carefully constructed, but she was beginning to recognize Eli's particular brand of generosity, the kind that protected both giver and receiver from awkwardness. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, approaching him as he unloaded lumber, "for the step repair, would you join us for dinner? I'm making a stew that should be ready by noon." This time, he didn't immediately refuse. Instead, he glanced toward the children, who were still exclaiming over their coats, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "If it's not too much trouble," he said finally. "No trouble at all," Ruth assured him. "In fact, it would be a pleasure to cook for someone who appreciates good food." As the morning progressed, Ruth found herself preparing the meal with unusual care. She had managed to acquire some beef bones from the butcher in town, trading mending, work for the ingredients, and had been simmering them since dawn to create a rich broth. Wild onions gathered by the children, preserved carrots from their small garden, and herbs she had dried through the autumn combined to create something that smelled like comfort itself. Eli worked steadily on the steps, with Tommy and Peter as his eager assistants. Ruth could hear their conversation through the open kitchen window, practical discussions about wood grain and nail placement, but also gentle questions about the children's interests and dreams. She was struck by how naturally he spoke to them, without condescension or impatience, treating their questions with the same seriousness he would give to adult concerns. "He's good with them," Mary observed, appearing at Ruth's elbow with an armload of vegetables to be chopped. "Yes, he is," Ruth agreed, watching through the window as Eli patiently showed Peter how to drive a nail without splitting the wood. "Do you think he's lonely?" Mary continued, her young face serious with thought. "Living all by himself on that big ranch?" Ruth considered the question while she stirred the stew. "I think everyone gets lonely sometimes. Some people are just better at hiding it than others. You get lonely too, don't you?" Mary asked with the devastating directness of adolescence. "Even with all of us here?" The question caught Ruth off guard with its perceptiveness. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But it's different now than it was before I came here. Before, I was alone with my sadness. Here, well, I suppose I'm learning that there are different kinds of loneliness." Mary nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "The kind where you're sad about something that's gone, and the kind where you're waiting for something that might come." Ruth looked at the girl with new respect. At 14, Mary already understood truths about the human heart that many adults never learned. "That's very wise, Mary." "Not really," Mary replied with a shrug. "I just pay attention. And I've noticed how you and Mr. Thatcher look at each other when you think nobody's watching." Heat flooded Ruth's cheeks, but before she could respond, Eli himself appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hat in his hands and his hair slightly mussed from the morning's work. "Mrs. Albright," he said, his formal tone not quite masking something warmer in his eyes. "The children tell me dinner is ready." "Almost," Ruth replied, grateful for the distraction from Mary's too perceptive observations. "Just give me a moment to get everything on the table." The meal that followed was unlike any the orphanage had hosted before. The long table, which usually echoed with the practical chatter of daily life, seemed transformed by the presence of their guest. Eli sat between Tommy and Peter, answering their questions about ranch work and cattle management, while sampling Ruth's stew with evident appreciation. "This is excellent," he said, his praise carrying the weight of someone who rarely offered compliments. I haven't tasted cooking this good since my mother passed. How long ago was that? Asked Sarah, her question innocent, but touching on what Ruth sensed was painful territory. 8 years, Eli replied, his voice steady but his eyes growing distant. She died in the winter of 77 pneumonia. And your father? Reverend Morrison asked gently. Same winter, 3 days after my mother. Eli's hands stilled on his spoon, and Ruth saw him swallow hard. He just couldn't seem to fight the sickness once she was gone. Ruth felt her heart clench with sympathy. To lose both parents so close together, to be left alone at what must have been a young age, she began to understand the walls he had built around himself. I'm sorry, she said softly. That must have been terribly difficult. Eli met her eyes. Across the table, and in that moment, Ruth saw past his careful control to the young man who had buried his parents and spent 8 years learning to live with solitude. It was but time. Time has a way of making even the sharpest pain bearable. Does it ever stop hurting? Asked Anna, her young voice carrying its own understanding of loss. Eli considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. It changes. He said finally, the hurt becomes part of you, but it doesn't rule you anymore. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you find new reasons to be grateful for the time you had with the people you loved. Ruth found herself blinking back tears at the quiet wisdom in his words. Around the table, the children absorbed this lesson about grief and healing, their young faces reflecting their own experiences with loss and abandonment. The conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics, the children's lessons, plans for winter preparations, and Tommy's progress in learning carpentry. But Ruth remained aware of the deeper currents running beneath the surface. The way Eli's presence seemed to complete something that had been missing from their family circle. After the meal, as the children cleared the table and returned to their afternoon activities, Ruth found herself walking with Eli toward the newly repaired front steps. The work was beautifully done, solid and level, built to last through many prairie winters. Thank you, she said, gesturing toward the steps. For this, and for the coats, and for being so kind to the children. Eli shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. They're good children. They deserve better than broken steps and threadbare clothing. They deserve many things, Ruth agreed, but kindness might be the most important. You've given them that. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as Benjamin played with his wooden horse in the yard, while the older children attended to various chores. The domestic scene had a peaceful quality that seemed to settle something restless in both of them. Mrs. Albright, Eli said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been uncertainty. Would it be? That is, would you mind if I came by again? To check on the calf and see how the repairs are holding up? Ruth felt something, warm and hopeful, bloom in her chest. You would always be welcome here, Mr. Thatcher. The children have grown quite fond of you. And you? The question slipped out before he could stop it, and Ruth saw surprise flicker across his features at his own boldness. She met his eyes steadily, her heart beating faster, but her voice calm. I find your company very pleasant as well. It was a modest admission, carefully phrased to avoid presumption, but Ruth saw it land with more impact than she had expected. Something shifted in Eli's expression, a softening of the perpetual guardedness that marked his interactions with the world. Then I'll come again, he said simply. Soon. Ruth watched him drive away, noting how he turned in his seat to wave at the children before disappearing over the rise. Beside her, Mary appeared with her usual silent approach. He'll be back before the week's out, Mary predicted with the confidence of someone who had been observing carefully. What makes you so certain? Ruth asked, though she suspected Mary was right. Because, Mary said with a small smile, he forgot his work gloves on the kitchen table. And men, like Mr. Thatcher, don't forget things, unless they want an excuse to come back. Ruth looked toward the kitchen, where indeed a pair of worn leather gloves lay beside Eli's empty coffee cup. She found herself smiling as she picked them up, noting how the leather was shaped by years of honest work, softened by use into something that would fit only one man's hands. Perhaps Mary was right. Perhaps some things were forgotten on purpose, small excuses that allowed the heart to find its way back to where it wanted to be. Ruth folded the gloves carefully and placed them on the shelf beside her late husband's Bible. Two tokens of different kinds of love waiting for their proper time to be claimed. Eli returned for his gloves 3 days later, arriving just as Ruth was gathering the last of the wild herbs that would flavor their meals through the coming winter. She was moving slowly through the prairie grass behind the orphanage, her condition making the simple task more laborious than it had been even a month before. The bundle of herbs in her gathering basket told a story of adaptation and survival wild. Sage that would season their limited meat, prairie mint for digestive troubles, and the hardy grass that the children had learned to brew into a tea that helped with winter colds. Each plant represented knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned to find sustenance in harsh places. Asterisk, Mrs. Albright. Eli's voice carried across the distance, warm with something that might have been relief at finding her. Should you be out here alone in your condition? Ruth straightened carefully, one hand pressed to the small of her back. I'm perfectly fine, Mr. Thatcher, though I admit I move somewhat slower than I once did. He approached through the tall grass with ground-eating strides, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made her suddenly conscious of her flushed cheeks and wind-blown hair. You shouldn't be lifting things, bending and reaching like that. What if something happened and no one knew where you were? The concern in his voice was unmistakably personal, going far beyond simple neighborly worry. Ruth felt her heart perform an uncomfortable flutter at the realization that someone cared enough to fear for her safety. The children know where she said gently. And I'm not made of spun glass, Mr. Thatcher. I've been caring for myself for quite some time. That doesn't mean you should have to, he replied, then seemed startled by his own words. Color crept up his neck, and he cleared his throat roughly. That is, I came to retrieve my gloves. I believe I left them in your kitchen. Ruth smiled at his obvious discomfort, finding his awkwardness oddly endearing. Of course, they're waiting for you. But since you're here, perhaps you could help me carry this basket. It seems to have grown heavier as the morning progressed. Eli took the gathering basket without hesitation, his large hands making it appear almost delicate. As they walked back toward the orphanage, Ruth found herself studying his profile, noting the way the autumn light caught the silver threads beginning to show in his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into prairie sun. Tell me about your herbs, he said, peering into the basket with genuine curiosity. I recognize some of them, but others are unfamiliar. Ruth felt a small glow of pleasure at his interest. My mother taught me, and I learned more from the Indian women we encountered on our journey west. This one, she touched a bundle of silvery leaves, is sage. It keeps meat from spoiling and adds flavor when fresh food is scarce. And this, she lifted a sprig of hardy mint, makes a tea that settles upset stomachs. Practical knowledge, Eli observed approvingly. The kind that keeps people alive when other remedies fail. Exactly. Though I've learned that the children respond as much to the care behind the remedy as to the medicine itself. Sometimes the act of being tended matters more than what the tending involves. Eli glanced at her with an expression that suggested her words had struck something deeper than simple conversation. That single quote's wise. I hadn't thought of it that way. They had reached the orphanage yard where the children were engaged in their usual afternoon activities. Tommy was teaching Peter advanced carpentry techniques using scraps from Eli's recent donations, while Mary supervised the younger children in a game that involved tossing stones into patterns drawn in the dirt. Mr. Thatcher. Benjamin's cry of delight carried across the yard as the little boy spotted their visitor. He came running with his wooden horse clutched in one hand, his face bright with excitement. Look, Papa Horse learned a new trick. Ruth watched with interest as Eli crouched down to Benjamin's level, his attention focused entirely on the child's enthusiastic demonstration. The wooden horse was made to gallop across imaginary plains, jump over stick fences, and perform various feats of equine daring that existed only in a 4-year-old's vivid imagination. That's quite a horse you have there, Eli said solemnly. "He looks fast enough to outrun the wind." "Mrs. Ruth says her papa made him special," Benjamin confided, his voice dropping to what he clearly considered a whisper, but which carried perfectly to the adults nearby. "He put love into every cut of his knife." Ruth saw Eli's eyes lift to meet hers over Benjamin's head, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding of what it meant to inherit love, to carry forward the gifts of those who had gone before. "Your papa must have been a skilled carpenter," Eli said to Benjamin, but his words seemed aimed at Ruth as well. "He was," she replied softly. "He had very patient hands." The afternoon proceeded with Eli helping Tommy and Peter with their carpentry project, while Ruth prepared an early supper. She found herself stealing glances out the kitchen window, watching the easy way he interacted with the boys, noting how naturally he fell into the role of teacher and guide. "He's staying for supper again," Mary observed, appearing at Ruth's elbow with her characteristic silent approach. "I invited him," Ruth admitted, checking the pot of beans that had been simmering since morning. "It seems the neighborly thing to do." Mary replied with the skeptical tone of someone far older than her 14 years. "Is that what we're calling it?" Before Ruth could respond to this impertinent observation, Sarah burst through the kitchen door with news that drove all thoughts of romance from everyone's mind. "Mrs. Ruth, come quick. Something's wrong with little Emma." Ruth abandoned her cooking and hurried outside, her heart already racing with the particular fear that came with having children in one's care. She found Emma sitting in the dirt near the barn, her small face flushed with fever and her breathing shallow and rapid. "How long has she been like this?" Ruth asked, kneeling beside the 7-year-old with careful attention to her own balance. "She said her head hurt during arithmetic," Mary reported, her young face creased with worry, "and she couldn't eat her lunch. I thought she was just being fussy, but then she started shivering, even though it's warm today." Ruth pressed her hand to Emma's forehead, feeling the telltale heat of rising fever. The child's eyes were glassy and unfocused, and when Ruth lifted her hand to check her pulse, she could feel the rapid flutter of a heart working too hard. "We need to get her inside," Ruth said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the fear, clutching at her chest. "And we need cool water, and I'll carry her." Eli's voice came from directly behind her, and Ruth felt a wash of relief at his steady presence. Without waiting for permission, he scooped Emma into his arms with the gentle competence of someone accustomed to handling fragile things. The next several hours blurred together in the particular urgency that comes with a sick child. Ruth moved between Emma's bedside and the kitchen, brewing teas from her precious herbs while monitoring the little girl's condition. Eli stayed close, fetching water, helping to cool Emma's fever with damp cloths, and keeping the other children calm with his quiet presence. "Is she going to be all right?" Anna whispered, her thumb creeping toward her mouth in the way it did when she was frightened. "She's going to be fine," Ruth assured her, though privately she worried about the persistence of Emma's fever. "Sometimes little ones get sick quickly, but they also get better quickly. We just need to help her body fight whatever is making her feel poorly." As evening fell, Emma's fever began to break. Her breathing eased, and when Ruth offered her small sips of mint tea, the child was able to keep them down. The crisis had passed, but the experience had shaken everyone in the household. "You have good instincts," Eli said quietly, as they sat vigil beside Emma's bed, "and steady hands in a crisis." Ruth looked up from bathing Emma's face with cool water, suddenly aware of how the lamplight played across Eli's features, softening the harsh lines that daytime seemed to carve there. "I've had practice. When you're responsible for people's well-being, you learn to act first and worry later." "Not everyone learns that lesson," Eli replied. "Some people fall apart when others need them most." There was something in his voice that suggested personal experience with such failures, and Ruth found herself wondering about the losses that had shaped him, the responsibilities he had carried alone for so many years. "Have you ever thought about having children of your own?" The question slipped out before Ruth could stop it, and she immediately felt heat flood her cheeks at her presumption. Eli was quiet for so long that Ruth began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the weight of old grief. "I used to. My parents always assumed I would marry, carry on the family name. But after they died," he shrugged, the gesture encompassing years of solitude. "It seemed easier to avoid the possibility of loss altogether." Ruth understood the logic of such thinking, the way grief could make a person wary of opening their heart to new risks. But watching him with Emma, seeing the gentle way he had handled the crisis, she also saw the waste of keeping such natural tenderness locked away. "Loss is always a possibility," she said softly. "But so is love. So is the kind of joy these children bring, even when they're sick and frightening us half to death." Eli's eyes met hers in the lamplight, and Ruth saw something shift in their depths, a crack in the armor he had built around his heart. "You make it sound simple." "Not simple," Ruth corrected. "Just ... worthwhile. The risk is worth the reward, most of the time." They sat in comfortable silence after that, taking turns, monitoring Emma's breathing and adjusting her blankets. Around them, the orphanage settled into its nighttime rhythms, the other children finally convinced that their little sister would recover. "Mrs. Albright," Eli said, as the evening grew late and Emma's sleep deepened into natural rest, "I want you to know that if you ever need help with the children, with anything, you only need to ask." The offer was carefully phrased, formal enough to avoid presumption, but sincere enough to convey real meaning. Ruth felt her heart warm at this evidence of his growing attachment to their little family. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Thatcher, and I want you to know that you're always welcome here. The children have grown quite fond of you, and—" she paused, gathering courage. "So have I." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Ruth saw surprise flicker across Eli's features, followed by something that looked like relief, as if he had been hoping for exactly such a declaration. "I'm fond of all of you as well," he said finally. "More than I expected to be. More than might be wise for a man in my position." "What position is that?" Ruth asked gently. "A man with little to offer, except a lonely ranch and a heart that forgot how to trust in permanence." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the quiet pain in his words. "Oh, Eli," she said, his given name slipping out naturally in the intimacy of the moment. "You have so much more to offer than you realize. Tonight proved that. The way you helped with Emma, the way you care for all of us ... that's worth more than any material wealth." He studied her face in the lamplight, and Ruth saw wonder there, as if her words had revealed a possibility he had never considered. "You really believe that?" "I know it," Ruth replied with quiet certainty. "And I think, if you let yourself, you'll come to know it too." Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something incoherent before settling back into peaceful rest. The small sound reminded them both of the precious nature of the moment, the way crisis could strip away pretense and reveal what truly mattered. "Should go," Eli said reluctantly. "It's late, and you need rest. Will you come back?" Ruth asked, not caring if the question revealed too much of her growing feelings. "Soon? Tomorrow," he promised, "to check on Emma and to—" He paused, then smiled with an expression Ruth had never seen before, one of hope cautiously emerging from long dormancy. "To see how that prairie mint tea is working." After he left, Ruth sat beside Emma's bed until well past midnight, listening to the child's peaceful breathing and thinking about the evening's revelations. She touched the small bundle of herbs on the bedside table, these simple plants that had helped heal a child, and somehow opened a door between two guarded hearts. Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of approaching winter, but inside the orphanage, something warm and hopeful was taking root, as hardy and resilient as the wild herbs that flourished in even the harshest soil. Eli kept his promise, returning the next day and every day after for the following week. What had begun as concern for Emma's recovery gradually evolved into something deeper, a rhythm of shared meals, quiet conversations, and the comfortable domesticity of a man finding his place in a ready-made family. Ruth watched this transformation with growing wonder and carefully guarded hope. The gruff, solitary rancher who had first brought them the sick calf was slowly revealing himself to be a man of surprising gentleness, one who remembered the names of all 12 children and their individual quirks and dreams. On the 7th day of his visits, he arrived carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth that he handled with the particular care reserved for precious things. Ruth was in the kitchen, teaching Sarah the delicate art of making biscuits light enough to float, when she heard the children's excited voices in the yard. "What do you suppose he's brought now?" Sarah asked, peering out the window with the frank curiosity of adolescence. "I'm sure we'll find out soon enough," Ruth replied, though she was every bit as curious as her young student. Eli's gifts had a way of being both practical and thoughtful, addressing needs she hadn't even realized they had. The mystery was solved when Tommy burst through the kitchen door, his face bright with excitement. "Mrs. Ruth, Mr. Thatcher made something for you." Ruth wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and followed Tommy outside, where she found Eli standing slightly apart from the cluster of children, his expression carrying that particular combination of pride and uncertainty that marked a craftsman presenting his work. "I thought you might have use for this," he said, unwrapping his bundle to reveal a wooden spoon unlike any Ruth had ever seen. The handle was perfectly shaped to fit a woman's grip, carved from what appeared to be maple and polished to a warm honey color. But it was the care evident in every curve, every smooth surface, that took Ruth's breath away. "You made this?" she asked, accepting the spoon with hands that trembled slightly. The wood was warm to the touch, shaped by hours of patient work, and when she turned it in the light, she could see the subtle patterns in the grain that Eli had preserved and enhanced. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers along the handle. "I've never owned anything so fine." Eli's cheeks colored slightly at her praise. "You do so much cooking for all of us. I thought you deserved a proper tool for the work." The phrase "all of us" didn't escape Ruth's notice, nor the way it seemed to slip out naturally, as if Eli had already begun thinking of himself as part of their household. The realization sent warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. "It's perfect," she said, meaning far more than just the spoon. "Thank you." That evening, Ruth used Eli's spoon to stir a pot of vegetable soup that had been simmering since morning. The implement felt perfectly balanced in her hand, and she found herself thinking about the hours Eli must have spent carving it, the way he had shaped it specifically for her use. There was something profoundly intimate about the gift, more personal than the practical lumber and supplies he had brought before. "He's sweet on you," Mary observed with the matter-of-fact tone she used for stating obvious truths. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but didn't deny the observation. "Perhaps," she admitted, "and I find I'm fond of him as well." "More than fond, I'd say," Mary continued with a small smile. "You hum when you cook now, and you've started wearing your good dress even on ordinary days." Ruth glanced down at the blue calico dress she had indeed chosen with more care than usual that morning. "It's important to make an effort," she said weakly. "Yes," Mary agreed solemnly, "especially when the effort is for someone special." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the children's sleeping area. Emma, still weak from her recent illness, had woken from a nightmare and was crying for comfort. Ruth hurried to tend to her, finding the little girl trembling with residual fear. "What is it, sweetheart?" Ruth asked, settling on the edge of Emma's narrow bed. "I dreamed about being all alone," Emma whispered, her small hand clutching Ruth's sleeve. "I dreamed you went away and left us, like other people have." Ruth's heart clenched at the fear in the child's voice, the way her recent illness had stirred up old anxieties about abandonment. "Oh, darling, I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now, with all of you. But what if you change your mind? What if you decide we're too much trouble?" The question revealed the deep insecurity that lived in all the orphan children, the knowledge that adults could disappear from their lives without warning. Ruth gathered Emma into her arms, feeling the child's slight weight and the trust implicit in her willingness to be comforted. "I will never leave you," Ruth said firmly. "Not ever. You are my children now, all of you, and nothing can make me stop loving you or wanting to care for you. Promise?" Emma whispered against Ruth's shoulder. "I promise," Ruth replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As she soothed Emma back to sleep, Ruth became aware of a presence in the doorway. Eli stood there quietly, having apparently come inside to check on them when he heard the crying. His expression was soft with something that might have been longing as he watched her comfort the frightened child. "She's afraid of being abandoned." "Again," Ruth explained quietly as Emma's breathing deepened into sleep. "They all are, I suspect," Eli replied, stepping into the room with careful quiet. "It's natural, even what they've experienced." "Yes, but it breaks my heart every time. These children deserve to feel secure, to know that the adults in their lives won't simply disappear." Eli was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on Emma's peaceful face. "It's a rare gift you're giving them," he said finally. "That kind of certainty, that promise of permanence." "It's not a gift," Ruth corrected gently. "It's just love, the kind every child should have." "Not every child is so fortunate," Eli said, and something in his voice suggested he spoke from personal experience. Ruth looked up at him, noting the way his hands clenched slightly at his sides, the tension that had crept into his shoulders. "Were you fortunate in that way?" Eli considered the question, his gaze distant. "My parents loved me, yes, but they were fragile people in their way, my mother especially. She lived in constant fear that something terrible would happen to the people she cared about. When my father got sick, she couldn't bear the thought of living without him. The revelation hung in the air between them, explaining so much about Eli's reluctance to open his heart to new attachments." Ruth felt a surge of understanding for the boy who had watched his parents' love story end in tragedy, who had learned that caring deeply could lead to devastating loss. "Love doesn't always end in tragedy," she said softly. "Sometimes it's the thing that helps us survive the tragedies that come anyway." Eli's eyes met hers in the dim light, and Ruth saw in them a war between hope and fear, between the desire to believe her words and the experience that had taught him otherwise. "I'm beginning to understand that," he said quietly. "Being here, watching you with the children, it's changing how I think about a lot of things, such as—" Eli was quiet for so long that Ruth began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, such as whether it's possible for a man to start over. "Whether someone like me could ever be worthy of this." He gestured around the room, encompassing not just the space, but everything it represented: family, belonging, love freely given and received. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the vulnerability in his words. "Oh, Eli, you're already part of this, don't you see? You've been part of our family from the moment you brought us that sick calf. The children adore you. And I—" She paused, gathering courage. "I've come to depend on your presence here. To look forward to it, even knowing what you know about me, about my history of avoiding attachment, of choosing solitude over the risk of caring." "Especially knowing that," Ruth replied firmly, "because it makes your choice to be here, with us, all the more meaningful." Eli stepped closer, close enough that Ruth could see the way her words had affected him, the hope beginning to overcome the fear in his expression. "Ruth," he said, her name soft on his lips, "I need you to know that what I feel for you, for all of you, it's stronger than anything I've ever experienced. It terrifies me and thrills me in equal measure." Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs at his confession, at the raw honesty in his voice. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "I never expected to care for anyone again the way I cared for my husband. But what I feel for you, it's different, but no less real." "Different how?" Eli asked, and Ruth could see that her answer mattered deeply to him. "With my husband, love grew slowly, from friendship and shared dreams. With you, .. She paused, searching for the right words. "With you, it feels like coming home to a place I never knew I was looking for." Eli's breath caught at her words, and for a moment Ruth thought he might kiss her. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and longing. But then Emma stirred in her sleep, reminding them both of where they were and the proprieties that governed their world. "I should go," Eli said reluctantly, though he made no move toward the door. "It's late and people talk." Let them talk, Ruth said with a boldness that surprised them both. I'm a widow with a household to run, and children to care for. If I choose to accept the friendship and assistance of a good man, that's my decision to make. Eli's smile was soft and wondering. Is that what I am? A good man? The best I've ever known, Ruth replied without hesitation. And if you're worried about my reputation, then perhaps it's time we considered making our ... arrangement more official. The words hung in the air between them, bold and unmistakable in their implication. Ruth felt her cheeks burn at her own forwardness, but she didn't regret the words. Life was too short and too uncertain to waste time on false modesty. When happiness might be within reach, Eli stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, hope, and something that looked like joy. Ruth Albright, he said slowly, are you proposing to me? Ruth lifted her chin with dignity, despite her flaming cheeks. I'm suggesting that two people who care for each other and for the same children might find mutual benefit in a legal union. I'm suggesting that practical arrangements can sometimes grow into something deeper, given time and goodwill. And what? If they've already grown into something deeper? Eli asked, stepping close enough that Ruth could feel the warmth radiating from his body. What if what I feel for you has nothing to do with practical arrangements and everything to do with the way you make me believe in possibilities I'd given up on? Ruth's breath caught at the intensity in his voice, at the way he was looking at her as if she were something precious and miraculous. Then I would say that perhaps we're both ready to stop being afraid of happiness. Perhaps we are, Eli agreed. And this time when he reached for her hand, Ruth didn't hesitate to place it in his . The gesture was simple, but it felt like a promise, a commitment to move forward together into whatever the future might bring. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass with the voice of changing seasons. But inside the orphanage, two hearts that had known loss were learning to hope again, strengthened by the wooden spoon that sat on the kitchen shelf, symbol of patient craftsmanship and the kind of love that took time to carve but lasted for generations. The legal document arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a nervous clerk from the county seat who seemed eager to complete his errand and return to more civilized territory. Ruth was hanging laundry behind the orphanage when Mary came running to find her, the official envelope clutched in her young hands like something that might explode. A man brought this, Mary said breathlessly. He said it was important legal business for Reverend Morrison, but the Reverend's gone to visit the Hendersons' sick baby. The man said someone needed to sign for it. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and took the envelope, noting the official seal and the precise handwriting. Bet marked it as coming from a lawyer's office. A cold tendril of fear wound through her chest as she considered what legal business might concern their small orphanage. Did the man say what it was about? She asked, though she was already breaking the seal with hands that trembled slightly. Something about property records, Mary replied, her young face creased with worry. Mrs. Ruth, you've gone pale. What does it say? Ruth unfolded the document, her eyes scanning the formal language with growing confusion and dismay. The words seemed to swim on the page. Notice of property ownership. Legal claim ... Eli Thatcher, sole proprietor. I don't understand, Ruth murmured, reading the document again more carefully. According to the papers in her hands, Eli owned not just his ranch, but also the land on which the orphanage sat. The chapel, the small house, the barn where the children kept their animals, all of it belonged to him, had belonged to him for years. Mrs. Ruth? Mary's voice seemed to come from very far away. What's wrong? Ruth sank onto the wooden stump where she often sat to watch the children play, the document still clutched in her hands. Her mind raced through the implications, the conversations they had had, the way Eli had spoken about helping them as if he were an outsider offering charity to strangers. He owns this place, she said quietly, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Mr. Thatcher owns the orphanage. Mary's eyes widened with shock. But how is that possible? Reverend Morrison never said. Perhaps Reverend Morrison doesn't know, Ruth replied, though even as she said it, she wondered if that could be true. How could a man live on property without knowing who owned it? How could rent be paid or taxes, or any of the practical matters that govern such things. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made both women look up to see Eli riding toward them across the prairie. Ruth felt her heart perform a complicated dance of joy at seeing him, and confusion at what she had just learned. She folded the document and slipped it into her apron pocket, needing time to think before confronting him with her discovery. "Good morning," Eli called as he dismounted, his face brightening at the sight of her in the way that had become familiar and precious over the past weeks. "I brought supplies for winterizing the windows. The nights are getting cold enough that the children shouldn't have to sleep in drafts." Any other day, Ruth would have felt warmed by his thoughtfulness, by the way he anticipated their needs before they even recognized them themselves. Today, his generosity felt different, tinged with questions she hadn't known to ask. "That's very kind of you," she said, her voice sounding strangely formal to her own ears. Eli's smile faltered slightly as he studied her face. "Is everything all right? You seem upset about something." Mary, clearly sensing the undercurrents of adult tension she didn't understand, mumbled something about checking on the younger children and disappeared into the house with uncharacteristic haste. Ruth found herself alone with Eli, the document burning like a secret in her pocket. Asterisk. "A clerk came by this morning," she said carefully, "with legal papers about the property." Ruth watched Eli's face change, saw the exact moment when understanding dawned and color drained from his features. His hands, which had been reaching to untie the supplies from his horse, stilled completely. "Ruth," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that confirmed her worst fears. "Let me explain. You own this place." It wasn't a question. Ruth stood slowly, her hand instinctively moving to protect her growing belly. "You own the orphanage, the land, everything. And you never thought to mention this small detail?" Eli took a step toward her, then stopped when he saw her move back. "It's not what you're thinking." "What am I thinking, Eli?" Ruth's voice was carefully controlled, but underneath the calm surface, hurt and anger warred for dominance. "Because what I'm thinking is that you've been playing some kind of game with us. Coming here with your gifts and your help, acting like a concerned neighbor, when all along you had the power to evict us whenever you chose." "That's not," Eli began, then stopped and ran his hands through his hair in obvious frustration. "You're right. I should have told you. But it's not what you think, Ruth. I would never hurt you or the children." "But you could," Ruth replied, and the simple truth of it hung between them like a blade. "That's the point, isn't it? You could turn us out tomorrow if you chose, and there would be nothing we could do to stop you." "I would never do that. But I didn't know that, did I?" Ruth's voice cracked slightly on the words. "I've been falling in love with you, planning a future with you, and all this time there was this enormous fact about our situation that you kept hidden. How am I supposed to trust anything else you've told me?" The word love seemed to hit Eli like a physical blow. He stepped forward again, his hands outstretched in supplication. "Ruth, please, let me explain how this happened." "Yes," Ruth said, settling back onto the stump with careful dignity. "I think you'd better." Eli began to pace, his agitation evident in every line of his body. "I inherited the property when my parents died. It was part of a larger parcel that my father acquired years ago, before the town even existed. Most of it became the ranch, but this section," he gestured toward the orphanage buildings, "my father deeded it to the church before he died, but there was some problem with the paperwork. A legal technicality that meant ownership reverted to me." "And Reverend Morrison knows this?" "Yes," Eli admitted reluctantly. "He's known from the beginning. But I told him I had no interest in the property, that he was welcome to use it for the orphanage as long as needed." Ruth felt a new kind of hurt bloom in her chest. So everyone knew except me. The woman who's been living here, caring for the children, making this place her home, she was the only one left in the dark. "It wasn't meant to be a secret from you specifically," Eli said desperately. "It just, the subject never came up. And then time passed, and it became harder to bring up without it seeming like I'd been deliberately deceptive." "But you had been deliberately deceptive," Ruth pointed out with devastating calm. "Maybe not maliciously, But you made a choice every day not to tell me something that fundamentally affects my life and the lives of these children. Eli stopped pacing and faced her directly. You're right. I should have told you from the beginning. But Ruth, you have to understand, I never wanted you to feel beholden to me. I never wanted our relationship to be influenced by the fact that I own this land. And what about now? Ruth asked quietly. Now that we've talked about marriage, about making our arrangement official, how does property ownership factor into that discussion? The question seemed to catch Eli off guard. He stared at her for a long moment, and Ruth could see him working through implications he perhaps hadn't fully considered. I don't know, he said finally, and the honesty in his admission was somehow more painful than a lie would have been. I haven't thought that far ahead. Ruth felt something cold and final settle in her chest. Haven't you? Because it seems to me that a man who owns the property where a woman lives, who courts that woman while keeping his ownership secret, might have quite a lot of advantages in any negotiation about their future. That's not I would never use. My position, too, Eli's protest died as he seemed to realize how his actions might appear from her perspective. Wouldn't you? Ruth stood again, her voice gaining strength as her initial shock transformed into righteous anger. You've been the one with all the power in this relationship, Eli. You've known all along that you could change the terms of my living situation with a word. You've let me believe I was making independent choices about my life and my future when, really, I've been entirely dependent on your continued goodwill. The children need you, Eli said desperately. I need you. I would never do anything to jeopardize. What you need, Ruth interrupted, is to understand that trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. I need time to think about what this means, about whether I can believe anything else you've told me. Eli's face went white at her words. Ruth, please don't. Don't what? Don't protect myself and these children from a situation I clearly don't understand as well as I thought I did. Ruth pulled the legal document from her pocket and held it up between them. This changes everything, Eli. Everything. It doesn't have to, he said quietly. The feelings between us, they're real. What we've built here, what we could have none. Of that has to change because of some legal technicality. Legal technicality? Ruth's voice rose slightly before she caught herself and glanced toward the house where the children might overhear. Eli, you own my home. You own the place where I sleep, where I cook, where I care for these children. How is that a technicality? Eli opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeming to finally understand the enormity of what he had. Kept hidden. What do you want me to do? He asked finally. How can I fix this? Ruth looked at him for a long moment. This man she had been falling in love with, this man who had carved her a spoon with his own hands and comforted sick children and made her believe in second chances. The betrayal felt like a physical ache in her chest, made worse by the genuine confusion in his eyes. The way he seemed honestly not to understand why his secret hurt so much. I don't know if you can fix it, she said quietly. I need time to think. Time to figure out what this means for me and for the children. How much time? Eli's voice was barely audible. I don't know that either, Ruth replied. But right now, I think it would be best if you stayed away for a while, until I can sort through all of this. Ruth saw the words hit him like physical blows, saw the hope in his eyes dim and die. For a moment she wavered, wanting to take back the harsh words, to find a way to bridge the gap that had opened between them. But then she thought of the children, of the responsibility she carried for their welfare, and she hardened her resolve. Ruth, Eli said, his voice breaking slightly on her name. I love you. I know I've made a terrible mistake, but I love you. The confession she had been longing to hear now felt like another weight on her chest. Love isn't enough, Eli, she said sadly. Not without trust, not without honesty. She turned and walked toward the house, leaving him standing beside his horse with the unused winterizing supplies still tied to his saddle. Behind her, she heard him call her name once more, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't afford to. Not when the children's security hung in the balance. Not when everything she had thought she knew about her situation had been revealed as an illusion. Inside the house, Mary was waiting with wide, worried eyes. Mrs. Ruth, what happened? Mr. Thatcher left without even saying goodbye to the children. Ruth pulled the legal document from her pocket and set it on the kitchen table, her hand surprisingly steady. We need to talk to Reverend Morrison when he returns, she said quietly. All of us. There are some things about our situation here that we need to understand better. As the sound of Eli's horse faded into the distance, Ruth sank into her chair and placed both hands on her growing belly. The baby moved restlessly, as if sensing her distress, and Ruth found herself whispering a prayer for wisdom, for strength, and for the courage to make the right choices for all the lives that depended on her God outside. The autumn wind rattled the windows that Eli had come to weatherize, and Ruth couldn't help but think how fitting it was that the first real cold should arrive just as the warmth she had been counting on disappeared, leaving her once again to face an uncertain future alone. 3 weeks passed without word from Eli Thatcher, 3 weeks during which Ruth discovered just how much she had come to depend on his presence. The children asked about him daily at first, their young faces confused by his sudden absence. Benjamin carried his wooden horse everywhere, as if the toy might somehow summon its maker back to them. When is Mr. Thatcher coming to see us? Little Anna asked during their evening Bible reading, her thumb hovering near her mouth in the way that betrayed her anxiety. I don't know, sweetheart, Ruth replied, the same answer she had given dozens of times. Each repetition made the words feel heavier, more final. Reverend Morrison had returned from his pastoral visit to find a household in quiet turmoil. Ruth had shown him the legal document, had listened to his gentle explanation of how the property arrangement had come to exist, and had struggled to reconcile this new information with a man she thought she knew. He never asked for rent, the Reverend had explained, his weathered hands folding and refolding the papers. Never made demands or set conditions. Mrs. Albright, I know this is difficult, but Eli Thatcher is a good man. He could have evicted you years ago if his intentions were anything but honorable. That's exactly the point, Ruth had replied. He could have. He still can. And I've been making plans for our future without knowing that fundamental fact about our situation. Now, as November settled over the prairie with its promise of harsh weather ahead, Ruth found herself struggling with more immediate concerns than matters of the heart. The orphanage's finances, never robust, had become genuinely precarious. The winter vegetables from their small garden were nearly exhausted, and the charitable donations that usually sustained them through the cold months had been disappointingly sparse. Ruth sat at the kitchen table after the children had gone to bed, working her way through columns of figures that refused to balance, no matter how many times she recalculated them. The baby moved restlessly within her, responding to her stress with increased activity that kept her awake long into the night. We could ask the congregation for additional help, Reverend Morrison suggested during one of their increasingly frequent financial discussions. Perhaps organize a special collection. The congregation has already given what they can, Ruth replied, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. These are hard times for everyone. I won't ask struggling families to sacrifice more for our sake. Then what do you suggest? Ruth stared at the numbers on the page, seeing not just their immediate needs, but the approaching crisis that winter would bring. I don't know, she admitted, but we'll find a way. We have to. What she didn't tell the Reverend was that she had been carrying on a different kind of calculation in her head, one that involved the growing restrictions her pregnancy was placing on her ability to work. A baby was due in early spring, and she was already finding it difficult to manage the heavier household tasks. Soon, she would need help rather than being able to provide it, a prospect that terrified her more than their financial problems. The first serious snowfall of the season arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, coating the prairie in a deceptive blanket of beauty that hid the danger beneath. Ruth woke to find ice crystals covering the inside of the windows and the children's water pitcher frozen solid on the washstand. It's cold, Mrs. Ruth, Sarah observed unnecessarily as she helped prepare breakfast. Colder than last year. Ruth nodded, her attention focused on stretching their meager supplies into something that would warm 13 people. The beans that had sustained them through the autumn were running low, and the cornmeal was getting close to the bottom of the sack. She found herself thinking of Eli's prediction about winterizing the windows, of the supplies he had brought. That still sat unused in the barn. "Tommy," she called to the 12-year-old who was stoking the fire. "After breakfast, could you and Peter see about getting those window materials Mr. Thatcher brought? We're going to need them." The boy nodded readily, but Ruth caught the look that passed between him and Mary. The children were old enough to sense the tension surrounding Eli's absence, old enough to understand that something had changed in the adult world that governed. Their lives that morning brought another unwelcome surprise. A visit from Mrs. Henderson, the general store owner's wife, who arrived bundled in furs and wearing an expression of barely concealed disapproval. "Mrs. Albright," she said without preamble, settling herself in the parlor like a judge preparing to render verdict. "I think we need to discuss your situation here." Ruth felt her spine stiffen at the woman's tone, but she kept her voice carefully neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Henderson." "Your condition." Mrs. Henderson's eyes flicked meaningfully toward Ruth's belly and the talk it's generating in town. "People are beginning to question whether it's appropriate for an unwed woman in your state to be caring for impressionable children." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. She had known that gossip followed her wherever she went, but she had hoped that her work with the orphans would speak louder than speculation about her personal life. "I'm a widow, Mrs. Henderson," Ruth said quietly. "My condition is the result of my marriage, not any impropriety." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Henderson replied with false sympathy. "But you must understand how it appears to others. A pregnant woman with no husband, no family support, taking on responsibilities that might be better handled by more suitable parties." "More suitable how?" Ruth's voice carried a note of steel, despite her effort to remain calm. "Well, there are institutions better equipped to handle orphan children, places with proper oversight and married couples to provide appropriate moral guidance." Ruth felt ice form in her veins at the woman's implication. "Are you suggesting that the children should be removed from their home?" "I'm suggesting," Mrs. Henderson said with the air of someone delivering unpleasant but necessary medicine, "that you might want to consider what's truly best for everyone involved. Your own child will need care when it arrives. These orphans deserve stability. Perhaps a transition to more appropriate arrangements would benefit all parties." After Mrs. Henderson left, Ruth sat in the empty parlor and allowed herself 5 minutes of pure panic. The woman's words had given voice to Ruth's own deepest fears, that she was inadequate to the task she had taken on, that her pregnancy made her vulnerable to those who would question her fitness as a caregiver. But as she listened to the children's voices from the kitchen, as she felt her own baby move within her, Ruth's fear transformed into fierce determination. These children were hers now, in every way that mattered. She would not allow them to be scattered to institutions or distant relatives who had never shown interest in their welfare. That the next crisis came 3 days later, in the form of little Benjamin developing a dangerous fever. Ruth found him burning with heat on Friday morning, his small body racked with chills despite the quilts piled around him. His breathing was labored, and his eyes held the glassy quality that spoke of serious illness. "Mary," Ruth called, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her heart. "Bring me cool water and clean cloths. Sarah, see if we have any of that willow bark tea left." As she worked to bring down Benjamin's fever, Ruth found herself desperately missing Eli's calm presence during Emma's illness weeks before. His steady hands, his quiet competence, the way he had taken charge of practical matters while she focused on the sick child, all of it seemed like a luxury. She could no longer afford that the fever raged for 2 days, during which Ruth maintained an almost constant vigil beside Benjamin's bed. She bathed his small body with cool water, coaxed sips of medicinal tea past his cracked lips, and sang the lullabies that seemed to soothe him when nothing else would. On Sunday morning, Benjamin's fever finally broke. Ruth woke to find him sleeping naturally, rather than in the restless stupor that had marked his illness, his breathing easy and his skin cool to the touch. The relief was so overwhelming that she had to step outside to compose herself, standing in the bitter morning air while tears of gratitude froze on her cheeks. It was there that Mary found her. The 14-year-old's face creased with worry that went beyond concern for Benjamin's health. "Mrs. Ruth," Mary said quietly, "there's something you need to know. While you were taking care of Benjamin, I overheard Tommy and Peter talking. They're scared." "Scared of what, sweetheart?" "They heard Mrs. Henderson talking to some of the other ladies after church about how maybe the children would be better off in that new orphanage in Topeka. How it's not right for you to be trying to manage everything by yourself, especially with your baby coming." Ruth felt the familiar ice of fear in her veins, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a fierce, protective rage that surprised her with its intensity. "Mary," she said firmly, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. No one is taking you children anywhere. This is your home, I am your family, and nothing Mrs. Henderson or anyone else says is going to change that. But what if they try to make us go?" Mary's voice was small, betraying the child beneath her premature maturity. Ruth pulled the girl into her arms, holding her close despite the awkward bulk of her pregnancy. "Then they'll have to go through me first. And I promise you, Mary, that's not going to be easy." That evening, as Ruth sat beside Benjamin's bed, working on the baby blanket she had been knitting for months, she found herself thinking about the pattern she was creating. Each stitch built on the ones before it, creating something stronger and more beautiful than the individual threads could ever be alone. But if one section was damaged, if the foundation wasn't secure, the whole piece could unravel. She thought about Eli, about the trust that had been damaged between them, about the feelings that remained despite the hurt. She thought about the children sleeping around her, about the baby growing beneath her heart, about the threats gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The blanket in her hands was nearly finished, its soft wool representing months of hope and preparation. Ruth ran her fingers over the careful stitches, each one placed with love and intention, each one part of something larger than itself. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and promising worse weather to come. But inside the orphanage, surrounded by the children she loved, and holding the blanket that would soon wrap her own baby, Ruth made a decision. Whatever came, whatever challenges the winter might bring, she would face them. She would protect this family she had built, this home she had created. And if that meant swallowing her pride and reaching out to the one person who might have the power to help them, then that was a choice she was prepared to make. The children's welfare was more important than her wounded heart, more important than her anger at being deceived. Ruth folded the baby blanket carefully and placed it in the basket beside her bed. Tomorrow she would send word to Eli Thatcher, not because she had forgiven him, not because she was ready to resume their interrupted courtship, but because the children needed protection that she alone might not be able to provide. The thought of seeing him again made her heart race with a mixture of longing and apprehension. But as she looked around at the sleeping children, as she felt her own baby move beneath her hands, Ruth knew she would do whatever was necessary to keep her family safe, even if it meant asking for help from the man who had broken her trust, the man she still loved despite everything that had passed between them. The message Ruth sent to Eli was brief and carefully worded. "The children need your help. Please come." She gave it to Tommy to deliver, watching the boy ride away on their old mare with a mixture of hope and dread knotting her stomach. Eli arrived within 2 hours, his horse lathered from hard riding, despite the bitter cold. Ruth watched from the kitchen window as he dismounted, noting the way he moved with barely controlled urgency, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man who had received an alarming summons. She met him at the door before he could knock, her heart performing its familiar traitorous leap at the sight of his face. 3 weeks had carved new lines around his eyes, and there was something different in his expression, a wariness that hadn't been there before, tempered by what looked like desperate hope. Ruth. Her name on his lips was soft, questioning. "Your message said the children needed help. Is everyone all right?" "For now," Ruth replied, stepping back to allow him entry. "But we need to talk. There are complications." Eli followed her into the parlor, his eyes scanning the room as if cataloging changes since his last visit. The children had appeared from various corners of the house, clustering in doorways with expressions that ranged from shy pleasure to outright delight at seeing him again. Mr. Thatcher. Benjamin's cry of joy broke the tension as the little boy launched himself across the room. His recent illness apparently forgotten in his excitement. Eli caught the child automatically, his face softening as Benjamin wrapped small arms around his neck. "Hello, little man. I've missed you too." Ruth watched the reunion with a mixture of warmth and pain. Whatever else had passed between them, Eli's affection for the children was genuine and mutual. The knowledge made what she had to tell him both easier and more difficult. "Children," she said gently, "could you give Mr. Thatcher and me a few minutes to talk? There are some grown-up matters we need to discuss." The children dispersed reluctantly, but not before each had received a greeting from Eli that acknowledged their individual personalities. Ruth noted how he remembered that Peter had been working on a new carving, how he asked Tommy about his carpentry progress, how he complimented Sarah on the way she was helping with the younger ones. When they were alone, the parlor suddenly felt too small, charged with all the words that had been left unsaid during their separation. "You look tired," Eli said quietly, his eyes taking in the circles under her eyes, the way her dress hung looser despite her advancing pregnancy. "It's been a difficult few weeks," Ruth admitted, settling carefully into her chair. "The children have been asking about you constantly. Benjamin carried that wooden horse you made him everywhere, as if it might bring you back." Something flickered in Eli's eyes, pain, perhaps, or regret. "I wanted to come. Every day I wanted to ride over here, but you asked me to stay away." "I needed time to think," Ruth said, "to understand what your ownership of this property meant for all of us." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Ruth met his eyes directly, drawing strength from the necessity of protecting the children. "That my feelings about your deception matter less than their welfare. They're in danger, Eli, and I need your help." She told him about Mrs. Henderson's visit, about the gossip threatening to separate the children from the only stable home they had known. She explained their precarious financial situation, the approaching winter, Benjamin's recent illness that she had handled alone. "There's talk of sending them to that new institution in Topeka," Ruth concluded. "The Ladies' Auxiliary thinks it would be more appropriate than allowing an unwed pregnant woman to continue caring for them." Eli's face darkened as she spoke, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "They want to break up the family you've built here because of small-minded gossip?" "That's exactly what they want to do," Ruth confirmed. "And legally, I'm not sure I can stop them. I have no official standing, no claim to the children beyond the fact that I love them and they love me. What do you need from me?" Eli asked. And Ruth was grateful for his directness, for the way he cut through emotional complications to focus on practical solutions. "Protection," Ruth said simply. "As the property owner, you have more legal standing than I do. If you were to formally support our arrangement here, it would make it much harder for them to force a change." Eli nodded slowly, but Ruth could see him working through the implications. "I can do that. I'll speak to the Ladies' Auxiliary. Make it clear that any attempt to interfere with the children's care would be unwelcome." "Thank you," Ruth said, relief flooding through her. "I know this is awkward, given everything that's happened between us, but, Ruth," Eli interrupted her, leaning forward in his chair, "there's something I need to tell you. Something that might change how you feel about my ownership of this property." Ruth felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What do you mean?" Eli reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, his movements careful and deliberate. "I've been working with a lawyer in the county seat, having papers drawn up to transfer ownership of this property to the church, properly this time, with no legal complications." Ruth stared at the document he held out to her, afraid to hope. "Transfer ownership? I never wanted to own this place," Eli said quietly. "I told you that before, and it was true. I kept putting off the legal work because it seemed like a lot of trouble for something that wasn't really a problem. But after our conversation, after seeing how my ownership affected you, I realized it needed to be resolved." Ruth took the document with trembling hands, scanning the legal language that formally deeded the orphanage property to the church. "When did you do this?" "I started the process the day after you asked me to stay away," Eli admitted. "It should be finalized within the week." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes as the implications sank in. Not only would the children be safe from eviction, but the threat of her own tenuous position would be eliminated. The property would belong to the church, making their residence there unassailable. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you give up such valuable land?" Eli's smile was sad but genuine. "Because it was never really mine to begin with. This place belongs to you and the children. You've made it what it is, a home, a family, something precious and important. I was just the name on a piece of paper." Ruth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, overwhelmed by the generosity of his gesture. "Eli, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "You need to let me help you in other ways too. The children shouldn't have to face winter without proper supplies, and you shouldn't have to handle everything alone, especially with your baby coming soon. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. And before you refuse, think about what's best for the children. They need warm clothes, adequate food, proper medical care if they get sick again. I have the means to provide those things." Ruth struggled between pride and practicality, between her hurt over his earlier deception and her responsibility to the children. "What would you want in return?" "Nothing," Eli said firmly, "except perhaps the chance to earn back your trust. The opportunity to prove that my feelings for you and the children are genuine, regardless of legal complications." Before Ruth could respond, a commotion outside drew both their attention to the windows. Through the glass, they could see a carriage. Approaching through the light snow that had begun to fall, an elegant vehicle that seemed out of place on the prairie roads. "Are you expecting visitors?" Eli asked, rising to get a better view. Ruth's heart sank as she recognized the passengers disembarking from the carriage. Mrs. Henderson was there, along with 2 other ladies from the church auxiliary and a man in a dark suit who carried himself with official authority. "It's Mrs. Henderson," Ruth said, her voice tight with apprehension. "And she's brought reinforcements." Mary appeared in the doorway, her young face pale with worry. "Mrs. Ruth, those people want to talk to you. The man says he's from the county, and he has papers." Ruth felt the baby move restlessly within her, responding to her spike of fear and anger. This was it, the confrontation she had been dreading, the moment when others would try to tear apart the family she had worked so hard to build. "Well then," Eli said quietly, moving to stand beside her chair, "I suppose it's time to make our position clear." Ruth looked up at him, this man who had hurt her with his secrets, but who was now offering to stand with her against those who would harm the children. Whatever complications existed between them personally, in this moment they were united in their determination to protect what mattered most. "Together?" she asked, the word carrying more weight than just the immediate crisis. "Together," Eli confirmed, and extended his hand to help her rise out as Ruth took his hand and stood to face their visitors. She felt something shift between them. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a recognition that some battles were more important than personal grievances. The children needed them both, and whatever the cost to her own wounded heart, she would not let them face this threat alone. The county official introduced himself as Mr. Pemberton, his manner formal and his purpose unmistakable. He carried a leather satchel that Ruth suspected contained documents that could change everything for the children, clustered nervously in the kitchen doorway. "Mrs. Albright," he began without preamble, "I've received several complaints about the conditions here and the suitability of the current arrangements for these orphan children." "What sort of complaints?" Ruth asked, though she could guess their source from Mrs. Henderson's satisfied expression. "Concerns about proper supervision, moral guidance, and the stability of care being provided by an unmarried woman in your condition." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward her pregnancy. "The county has a responsibility to ensure that dependent children are placed in appropriate homes." "These children are in an appropriate home," Eli interjected, his voice carrying quiet authority. "They're well cared for, properly educated, and clearly thriving under Mrs. Albright's care." Mr. Pemberton's attention shifted to Eli with obvious surprise. "And you are?" "Elias Thatcher. I own That is, I'm transferring ownership of this property to the church, specifically to ensure these children's security. Eli produced his own legal documents, the papers that would make the orphanage's tenure unassailable. Mr. Thatcher, Mrs. Henderson, interrupted with barely concealed irritation, while your generosity is commendable, it doesn't address the fundamental concern about Mrs. Albright's fitness as a caregiver. What exactly makes her unfit? Eli's tone was deceptively mild, but Ruth could hear the steel beneath it. The fact that she's created a loving home for 12 children who had nowhere else to go? The fact that she's taught them skills, given them stability, made them feel wanted and valued? The fact, Mrs. Henderson replied primly, that she's an unwed mother-to-be with no family support and questionable judgment about appropriate companions. The insult hit its mark, and Ruth felt heat flood her cheeks. But before she could respond, a small voice piped up from the kitchen doorway. Mrs. Ruth isn't unwed, Benjamin announced with the innocent conviction of a 4-year-old. She's going to marry Mr. Thatcher. She told us so. The words fell into absolute silence. Ruth stared at the little boy in horror, realizing that her private conversations with Mary about possibilities and hopes had been overheard and misunderstood by younger ears. Benjamin, she began weakly, but Eli's hand on her arm stopped her. Out of the mouths of babes, he said quietly, then looked directly at Mr. Pemberton. The boy is right. Mrs. Albright has agreed to become my wife. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. They had never discussed marriage since the revelation about the property, had barely begun to rebuild the trust that had been damaged. Yet here, he was publicly claiming her as his intended bride without hesitation. Is this true, Mrs. Albright? Mr. Pemberton asked, his pen poised over his paperwork. Ruth looked at Eli, seeing in his eyes a desperate hope mixed with determination. He was offering her more than just protection from gossip. He was offering himself, his name, his future, to keep the children safe. Yes, she said quietly, the word carrying the weight of a vow. It's true. Mrs. Henderson's face darkened with frustration. A hasty engagement to avoid scandal hardly addresses the concerns about... Actually, Eli interrupted smoothly. It addresses them completely. Mrs. Albright will be a married woman with a stable home and adequate financial support. The children will have both a mother and a father figure. What exactly is your remaining objection? Mr. Pemberton was already closing his satchel, apparently satisfied that the situation had been resolved to the county's satisfaction. Congratulations on your upcoming nuptials, he said formally. I trust you'll notify us of the ceremony date for our records? Of course, Eli replied. We were thinking this Sunday, weren't we, Ruth? This Sunday. 3 days away. Ruth felt dizzy at the speed with which her life was being reorganized, but she managed to nod agreement. Yes, this Sunday. After the official party had departed, leaving frustrated disapproval in their wake, Ruth found herself alone with Eli in the parlor, while the children celebrated their victory with noisy enthusiasm in the kitchen. Sunday? She asked weakly, sinking into her chair. Too soon? Eli's confidence seemed to evaporate now that they were alone. I thought, that is, the sooner we make it official, the sooner the children are protected from any future interference. And what about us? Ruth asked quietly. What about trust and forgiveness and all the things we haven't resolved? Eli knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his larger ones. I know I hurt you. I know I handled everything badly, and I know that saying I'm sorry isn't enough to undo the damage. No, it isn't, Ruth agreed, but she didn't pull her hands away. But I also know that I love you, Eli continued. Not just because you're good with the children, not just because you need protection, but because you're the strongest, most compassionate woman I've ever known. Because you make me want to be better than I am. Ruth felt tears threaten again at the raw honesty in his voice. I love you too, she admitted. That's what makes this so difficult. I love you, but I don't know if I can trust you not to hurt me again. Then let me prove it to you, Eli said urgently. Marry me on Sunday, not because we have to, but because we want to build something together. Let me spend the rest of my life showing you that my love is real, that my commitment to you and the children is absolute. And if I can't love you the way you deserve, If this broken trust takes years to heal? Eli's smile was gentle and infinitely patient. Then we'll take years. Ruth, I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for a chance. Before Ruth could respond, a sharp pain lanced through her lower back, followed immediately by a sensation she recognized with alarm. She gasped, her hands flying to her belly, as she felt the warm rush of fluid that signaled the beginning of labor. Ruth? Eli's voice sharpened with concern. What's wrong? The baby, she managed, gripping his hands tightly as another contraction began. It's coming, now. The next several hours blurred together in a haze of pain and urgency. Mary took charge of the younger children with remarkable competence, while Eli rode to fetch the midwife from town. Sarah boiled water and gathered clean linens, and even little Benjamin helped by staying out of the way and keeping the twins calm, not Mrs. Morrison. The midwife arrived as the sun was setting, her weathered face calm with the confidence of someone who had attended hundreds of births. How are we doing, dear? She asked Ruth, immediately taking charge of the situation. The contractions are close together, Ruth panted, gripping Eli's hand through another wave of pain. I think, oh God, I think something's wrong. The baby was indeed coming quickly, too quickly for Ruth's body to adjust properly. As the evening wore on and the labor intensified, it became clear that both mother and child were in danger. The cord is wrapped around the baby's neck, Mrs. Morrison announced grimly. We need to work fast. Ruth heard the words through a haze of exhaustion and pain, understanding their significance even as she struggled to maintain consciousness. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Eli's voice, steady and calm, talking her through each contraction, telling her she was strong, that she could do this. Push now, dear, Mrs. Morrison commanded. One more strong push, and we'll have your baby. Ruth gathered every ounce of strength she had left and pushed with desperate determination, thinking of the children who needed her, of the man whose hand anchored her to consciousness, of the baby who was fighting to enter the world. And then, suddenly, blessedly, there was relief. The baby's cry filled the room strong, healthy, unmistakably alive. Ruth collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as Mrs. Morrison placed a squirming, red-faced infant on her chest. A daughter, the midwife announced with satisfaction. Small but perfect, and with quite a set of lungs on her. Ruth looked down at her baby, her daughter, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. The tiny face was wrinkled and red, but her eyes were open and alert, as if she were taking measure of this new world she had entered. She's beautiful, Eli whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Absolutely beautiful. Ruth looked up to find tears in his eyes as he gazed at the baby, his expression filled with wonder and something that looked like paternal pride. Would you like to hold her? She asked softly. Eli accepted the infant with the careful reverence of someone handling something infinitely precious. The baby settled immediately in his arms, her tiny fist curling around his finger as if claiming him for her own. Hello, little one, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Welcome to the family. Ruth watched this scene through eyes heavy with exhaustion, but bright with joy. Whatever complications existed between her and Eli, whatever trust still needed to be rebuilt, in this moment she knew with absolute certainty that he would love and protect this child as if she were his own blood. Ruth, Eli said quietly, his eyes moving from the baby to her face, will you marry me? Not because of gossip or legal protection, but because I want to be this little girl's father. Because I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life knowing that you and all these children are mine to love and protect. Ruth reached up to touch his face, seeing in his eyes the man she had fallen in love with, the man whose secrets had hurt her, and the man who was offering her everything he had to give. Yes, she whispered, her daughter's warm weight against her chest, and Eli's love shining in his eyes. Yes, I'll marry you. Outside, the prairie wind continued to blow, but inside the orphanage, a new family had been born, not just through the arrival of one tiny baby, but through the choice to forgive, to trust, and to build something lasting. Together, spring arrived early on the Kansas prairie in 1886. bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to touch everything on the Thatcher ranch. Ruth stood on the porch of the expanded house, her daughter Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms, watching as the older children helped Eli with the morning chores. The orphanage had been transformed over the winter months into something that barely resembled the struggling institution Ruth had first encountered. What had once been a cramped chapel annex was now a proper home, with added rooms for the growing family and modern conveniences that made daily life immeasurably easier. Mrs. Thatcher, Mary called from the garden where she was teaching the younger children to plant vegetables. Hope's crying disturbed your rest again last night, didn't it? You should let me take the night feedings more often. Ruth smiled at the title that still felt new on her tongue, at the girl who had become her right hand in managing their expanded household. At 15, Mary was developing into a remarkable young woman, one who would soon be ready to make her own way in the world, though Ruth hoped that way would keep her close to the family that had become her anchor. "I'm fine, Mary," Ruth replied, adjusting Hope's blanket against the cool morning air. "Besides, I treasure these quiet moments with her. They won't last forever." The baby had indeed brought new challenges, along with immeasurable joy. Hope Thatcher was a determined child who seemed to approach life with the same fierce independence that had marked her mother's journey west. At 4 months old, she already showed signs of a strong will and an alert intelligence that suggested she would be more than capable of holding her own among her many adopted siblings. Eli emerged from the barn, leading their newest acquisition, gentle Murray that would serve as a riding teacher for the children who were old enough to learn proper horsemanship. His movements had lost the careful tension that had marked them during their courtship, replaced by the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. "Benjamin," he called to the little boy who was chasing chickens in the yard, "would you like to help me curry lady here? She needs to look her best for Tommy's riding lesson this afternoon." Benjamin abandoned his pursuit of the chickens with the enthusiasm of a child who had never met a task involving animals that didn't fascinate him. Ruth watched as Eli patiently showed the boy how to brush the Mare's coat, remembering the day 6 months ago when she had thought this man too reserved, too damaged by solitude, to ever fully embrace family life. Their wedding had taken place as planned on that December Sunday, in the same chapel where Ruth had first found shelter. The ceremony had been simple but meaningful, attended by the children and a handful of neighbors who had come to understand that the unusual family deserved support rather than suspicion. Ruth had worn her best dress, the blue calico that had seen her through so many significant moments, and Eli had presented her with his mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had been waiting 8 years for the right woman to wear it. The exchange of vows had been witnessed by 12 children, whose faces glowed with satisfaction at seeing their beloved Mrs. Ruth become permanently part of their world. "Do you, Ruth, take Eli to be your husband, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," she had whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being, despite the complications that still existed between them. The months that followed had not been without challenges. Learning to trust again, to blend their different approaches to household management and child-rearing, to navigate the intimate complexities of marriage while caring for a newborn and 12 other children. All of it had required patience, compromise, and more honest conversation than either of them had initially found comfortable. But somewhere in the midst of midnight feedings and arithmetic lessons, of kitchen negotiations and bedtime stories, they had found their rhythm. Ruth had learned to lean on Eli's strength without losing her own independence, and he had discovered that loving a large family didn't diminish him, but multiplied his capacity for joy. "Mama," Sarah appeared at Ruth's elbow, the 12-year-old. Having claimed the privilege of being Hope's first big sister, "I finished the new dress for Emma. Do you want to see it before I show her?" Ruth admired the tiny garment that Sarah held up proudly, a miniature version of her own dresses, complete with careful stitching and a small pocket for treasures. The girl's skill with a needle had developed remarkably over the winter, and Ruth suspected that Sarah would make an excellent seamstress when she was old enough to consider a trade. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Emma will be delighted." As Sarah ran off to present her gift, Ruth reflected on how each of the children had grown and changed over the past months. Tommy was developing into a skilled carpenter under Eli's tutelage, his projects becoming more ambitious and polished with each attempt. Peter's whittling had evolved into genuine artistry, his small carved animals bringing in a modest income from townspeople who had learned to appreciate his talent. The twins, Jacob and James, remained inseparable, but had found their individual interests, Jacob in cooking and James in the care of animals. Little Anna had overcome her thumb-sucking and was proving to be a natural teacher, helping Benjamin and the other youngest children with their letters and numbers. Even Emma, the child whose illness had brought Ruth and Eli together during a time of crisis, was thriving. The 7-year-old had developed into a sunny, resilient child whose laughter seemed to dispel any lingering shadows from her difficult early years. Ruth, Eli's voice drew her from her reflections, and she turned to see him approaching the porch, with the expression of barely contained excitement that had become familiar over the winter months. "I have news. Good news, I hope? The best kind." Eli settled beside her on the porch swing he had built specifically for these morning conversations, careful not to disturb Hope's sleep. "I've been corresponding with the territorial government about establishing a proper school district here. They've approved our proposal." Ruth felt her breath catch with excitement. Education for the children had been one of their ongoing concerns, particularly as they grew older and needed more advanced instruction than Ruth and Reverend Morrison could provide. "A real school? Here?" "A real school," Eli confirmed, "with a properly trained teacher and everything. The territorial government is so impressed with what we've accomplished here, taking in orphan children, establishing a stable family, contributing to the community, that they want to use us as a model for other rural settlements." Ruth shook her head in wonder at how their lives had evolved from that desperate autumn when she had arrived with nothing but a cast-iron skillet and hope. Who would have thought that a pregnant widow and a hermit rancher could create something worth emulating? "I think," Eli said softly, reaching over to stroke Hope's downy hair, "that love has a way of multiplying itself when it's given freely. We started with 2 broken people and 12 abandoned children, and somehow we've built something that's stronger than the sum of its parts." Ruth looked out over their land, watching as the children went about their various activities with the easy confidence of young people who knew they were loved and wanted. In the distance, she could see the spot where they planned to build the schoolhouse, where other children from neighboring farms would come to learn alongside their own. The photographer, who had come from the county seat the previous week to document their model family arrangement, had been amazed by what he found. Instead of the institutional setting he had expected, he had discovered a home filled with laughter, learning, and the organized chaos that marked any household with active children. "I'd like to take a formal portrait," he had suggested, something that shows the success of this arrangement for the territorial records. The resulting photograph now sat framed on Ruth's dresser, a formal posed image that captured a moment in time but somehow failed to convey the depth of feeling that bound them all together. In it, Ruth sat holding Hope while Eli stood behind them with his hands resting on her shoulders. The children were arranged around them in order of height, their faces serious with the importance of the occasion, but their eyes bright with happiness. "Do you ever wonder," Ruth asked now, adjusting Hope's blanket as a cool breeze stirred across the porch, "what would have happened if you hadn't brought us that sick calf?" Eli considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "I think we would have found each other eventually. Some connections are stronger than circumstance. Even with all the complications, the secrets, the misunderstandings, the way we both fought against caring." "Especially because of those things," Eli replied. "Love that comes easily doesn't teach you anything. Love that has to be fought for, that requires you to become better than you were, that's the kind that lasts." Ruth felt Hope stir in her arms, and looked down to find the baby's dark eyes open and alert, taking in the world with the grave attention that marked her approach to everything new. Those eyes, so like her father's, seemed to hold wisdom beyond her months, as if she understood that she had been born into something precious and worth protecting. "Hello, little love," Ruth murmured, touching her daughter's soft cheek. "Are you ready to see what this day will bring?" As if in response, hope made one of her small, contented sounds, not quite a coo, but more than a sigh. Ruth felt her heart swell with the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her to fight for the children's welfare all those months. A go-dot around them. The sounds of family life continued, Mary calling instructions to the younger children in the garden, Tommy's hammer ringing from the workshop, where he was building shelves for the new schoolhouse, the twins arguing amiably about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. These were the sounds of home, Ruth realized. Not the quiet order she had known in her first marriage, but the vibrant chaos of a large family where everyone had a place and a purpose. It was messier than the life she had planned, more complicated than anything she could have imagined, but it was also fuller, richer, more alive than she had ever thought possible. "Ruth," Eli said quietly, his arm coming around her shoulders as they sat together watching their children. "Thank you." "For what?" "For teaching me that some risks are worth taking. For showing me that love multiplies rather than diminishes when it's shared. For giving me a family I never knew I wanted and a future I never dared to dream of." Ruth leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the absolute certainty of his presence in her life. "Thank you for teaching me that second chances really do exist, that broken hearts can heal stronger than they were before, that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places." As the morning sun climbed higher in the Kansas sky, painting the prairie grass in shades of gold and green, Ruth Thatcher sat surrounded by the life she had built from scraps and determination, holding her sleeping daughter while her husband's arm encircled them both in warmth and protection. The cast-iron skillet that had traveled with her from Colorado still sat in the kitchen, now one of many cooking implements in a well-equipped household. But it remained special, a reminder of the journey that had brought her to this moment, of the way love could transform the most practical tools into instruments of grace. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter carried on the wind, mixing with the rustle of prairie grass and the gentle lowing of cattle. These were the sounds of a life well lived, of choices made with courage and hope, of love that had found a way to flourish in even the harshest soil. Ruth closed her eyes and listened to it all, holding the moment close to her heart, this perfect spring morning when everything she had ever wanted was finally, completely, beautifully hers.